Who really does that? When you get a chance to go. Yeah, just say like, hey, I missed this one. It's a lot.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Holocaust Genocide Interfaith Education Spring Lecture with Hasia Diner. We're very pleased and honored that she's with us here. It came all the way from NYU. So, and that's not easy on the one, as everyone knows. So I want to just give her a brief introduction, but I knew about Hasia Diner's work for quite some time. And in my own book, which is Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, I quote her. And not only do I quote her, but I quote her on her topic. And her topic is on her book, which is We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, 1945 to 1962. And this is from me in my book, and I'm very proud that I have a quotation by Dr. Diner. Here, Hasia Diner portrays another story of memorializing and understanding how American Jews, organically and through an array of organizations, told their story of the Shoah. Diner points out that memorial practices get made over time, and no one, scholars or others, ought to anachronistically expect them to be born whole and in final form. Because the memorial works of the post-war period differed from those of later decades does not mean that they did not exist. Diner makes a point to revisit the ways in which American Jews did commemorate and remember the Shoah. She also points out that the events in the United States had a deep impact on how and when Jewish American voices were being heard. An interesting point that she raises in her book is how indeed many scholars discuss the post-World War II era as a period of amnesia for the many survivors and their children. However, this interpretation by these scholars is debatable and factually unfounded, since the manner of remembering the Shoah needs to be considered in the socio-political context of the 1950s and 1960s America. So, Hasia Diner is also the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History, Professor Hebrew, Interim Director of Glucksmann Ireland House, NYU. She has numerous articles, and I'm not going to list them all. I'm just going to list a couple of books and her wonderful accomplishments. She was a Guggenheim Fellowship for 2011, Senior Postdoctoral Fellowship, Shelby Collin Davis Center for Historical Research, Princeton University, 2002 to 2003, Fellow American Academy of Jewish Research, Society of American Historians, one of the 20 living women historians included in American Women Historians, 1700s to the 1900s, Jennifer Scanlon and Sharon Costner, editors. She, of course, will talk tonight, We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, 1945 to 1962, which was published by New York University Press in 2009. Amongst her other books are The Jews of the United States, 1654 to 2000, Hungering for American, Italian, Irish, and Jewish Foodways in the Age of Migration by Cambridge University Press. So join me in welcoming Hasia Diner to the podium.
Oh, nice lights. Okay, I didn't realize there were so many people sitting behind me. So first I want to thank you so much for this lovely invitation and for the very generous words that you offered at the beginning here. So let me get right to the topic. So in 1952, the American Jewish Congress, which was the largest of the sort of communal, national Jewish communal bodies, called a small committee together made up of rabbis from each one of the denominations, some Hebrew scholars, a couple poets, one or two other individuals, and asked this committee to do something very specific, to write a short reading, okay, a liturgical work that would be read in people's homes during the Passover Seder, as well as at public gatherings, which would memorialize and invoke the horrendous events which had just engulfed the Jewish people, that event which we call the Holocaust. The committee did as charged. It prepared a reading, printed it on a piece of paper, folded over. One side was English, one side was Hebrew. So I just want to quote a bit from this very brief reading. So the first paragraph was an invocation, and it began, as the title of my book does, we remember with reverence and love the 6 million of our brothers of the European exile who died at the hands of a tyrant more wicked than Pharaoh who enslaved our fathers in the land of Egypt. Come, said he unto his minions, let the name of Israel be remembered no more. And then that paragraph went on to talk about the slaughter and some of the evoking the images of gas and poison and fires. That first paragraph ends with the words, we will not dwell on the deeds of the evil ones, lest we defame the image of God in which man is created. The second paragraph is very specific, and it valorizes and recalls the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which took place on Passover 1943, and it describes the ghetto fighters as people, quote, like Judah Maccabee in days of old, they brought glory to the name of Israel. Okay. The third paragraph, which is the one in which the Hebrew and the English actually deviated in a very important way from each other, is, again, even shorter, but packed quite a historical punch. So if I were to translate the Hebrew directly, it would say, from the depths the martyrs lifted their voice in a song of hope in the day when the Messiah would return. The invocation of the Messianic future, and use the words of the scholar, the Rabbi Maimonides, from whom those words were drawn. But the English went a little different, and it said, from the depths the martyrs lifted their voices in a song of hope for a day when justice and brotherhood would reign among men. Okay, so I'm going to come back a few times to that reading. This reading and so much of the work created by American Jews in the post-war period, text by text, artifact by artifact, political act by political act, gave the Holocaust a prominent place. It gave it a prominent place both when Jews talked to each other and also when they faced the larger American public, as they invoked the all too horrendous devastation which had taken place. Now, before getting into the details of this, these texts and these political acts and these artifacts, I want to just say something very quick, brief, as a kind of caveat. So first, everything I'm talking about was done in public. We don't know what people talk about in their private homes, around the dinner table, on the playgrounds, among kids, in family gatherings. That we cannot really retrieve, but we can know what went on and what was said in public spaces and in public venues. The Jews of the United States in this post-war period had no central agency which told them what to do, gave them no direction or guidance as to what constituted a memorial. They had no central symbol or metaphor which they invoked to stand for the Holocaust. And indeed, what they did was amorphous, we might say chaotic, scattered, grassroots, and experimental. And as Professor Afridi said before, cannot be compared to what will happen in the 1980s and 90s and beyond, because it was a different time. The Jews of the United States, in this spontaneous and scattered Holocaust memorialization, employed a range of words to name this event, and no one word was more central or more common than any other. They referred to it as Hitler's dark reign of terror, Hitler times, the catastrophe. Catastrophe was probably the most commonly used word. Sometimes catastrophe had a lowercase c, sometimes it had a capital C. The Great Catastrophe, the European catastrophe, the recent catastrophe, the 6 million, the concentration camps, among others. They used all of these words in their communal events, in the curricula of their schools, in the printed programs of communal events. They used all these words interchangeably. So I'm going to offer just one example, and I'm going to say, by the way, for every point I make, I'm going to give only one example, and do take my word that whatever example I give is just a brief possibility, and underneath it were icebergs of other such documents. So in the program notes, for example, for a concert of Jewish music performed in Chicago in 1953 by the Halevi Society, identified on the printed program that they would be singing a song by the poet Mordechai Gebertig. And as it said, his lullaby Yankala was written by Gebertig, quote, a victim of the crematoria. In 1954, the B'nai B'rith issued a study guide for interfaith activities, or interfaith study groups, and the book was called, the study guide was called, What Do You Know About Jewish History, Religion, Ethics, and Culture? And it referred to Hitler's ghastly program of extermination. Now, the word Holocaust did exist at the time. There's evidence of it being used as early as 1942. In the post-war period, as an example of this, the Jewish Museum, just down on Fifth Avenue, mounted an exhibit of the work of a painter named Abraham Wolkowitz, who had painted the in the Lower East Side at the turn of the 20th century. And the guidebook, the brochure for the exhibit described the children who Wolkowitz painted as people who, quote, a half-century has passed. These children have become grandparents. They have witnessed the Nazi Holocaust, which threatened the very existence of the Jews. So too in Yiddish, the press, the poets, the novelists, the hosts of radio shows, the orators, the survivors who spoke of their suffering at communal gatherings, the compilers of a genre of book called Yiskerbücher, literally memorial books, the writers of pedagogical material for Yiddish schools, also had no one word to pinpoint this event. They talked about Hitler's Zeiten, Hitler's times, or the Horben, the destruction. Sometimes it was just the Horben. Otherwise, they would talk the Der letzte Horben, the most recent destruction, Unser größer Horben, our great destruction, Horben Europa, the destruction of Europe, and very importantly and tellingly, they refer to it as Der dritte Horben, the third destruction, implying that the death of the 6 million Jews of Europe was as cataclysmic as the destruction of the first and second temples in 586 before the Common Era, and then 70 of the Common Era by the Babylonians and the Romans. But whatever they called it, whatever language they used, they posed the catastrophe in both deeply Jewish and broadly universal terms. That Sailor of Remembrance, like books, articles, sermons, literary works, liturgies, letters to public officials, blended a deeply felt personal anguish or communal anguish with concerns for humanity writ large. Hence, the English translation of that last paragraph of the Sailor of Remembrance invoked a time, quote, when justice and brotherhood would reign among men. They used we and our throughout these writings. Talk about the Holocaust, talk about the tragic fate of the 6 million, and programming in its name permeated American Jewish life. It wasn't the only thing they talked about, but it was always there. It united all the different strands of American Jewry, Reform, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, and Conservative. Despite their fundamental differences about Judaism as a religious system, they all made space for the Holocaust in their synagogues, seminaries, and publications. They did so very differently, because they were so different, but they did so nonetheless. American Zionists of every variant employed the Holocaust in their organizational work, as did Jews on the far left, probably best associated with a group called the Jewish People's Fraternal Order. But they didn't do it all in the same degree. They did it in the same degree as the B'nai B'rith, the Jewish war veterans, the Jewish Labor Committee, the American Jewish Congress, which sponsored that Passover reading, the National Council of Jewish Women, Hadassah, the Workmen's Circle, Pioneer Women, and on and on. Indeed, I cannot list all of the organizations, national and local, that recalled the 6 million and contemplated what the Holocaust meant for who they were in the public. All of these organizations created a repertoire of words and deeds that took as their inspiration the calamity of the 6 million. Okay. Now, some individuals in this community of about 5 million people put words on paper, conveying emotion, fact, through oratory and sermons, creating liturgies for synagogues and homes, fashioning a vast and spontaneous project which sought to keep alive the image of Europe's murdered Jews. Some American Jews, on their own or through the auspices of Jewish institutions, chiseled references to the tragedy on stone. Others turned to music, recording and performing a repertoire of works which stood for the Holocaust, like Mordechai Gebertig's Yankala. Those able to create dramas, pageants, poems, scholarly works, dances, graphic images, and organized public gatherings which took as their subject something about the Jews who had perished at the hands of the Nazis. Much larger numbers watched, listened, and read, consuming those texts, and thereby making the catastrophe organic to American Jewish public culture in the post-war period. Starting in the immediate post-war period, one community after another held every year a Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Evening. And indeed, once that Sailor of Remembrance was written, that was one of the premier places it was read and performed. These Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Evenings were held in large cities and smaller communities. Larger cities had 2 or 3 different Warsaw Ghetto Memorial programs, often competing with each other for the best speakers. But it didn't matter if the program was sponsored by a left organization or a insider mainstream communal organization. The program was very similar. So too, just as an example, and again, I alluded to this before, survivors and people who had come from hundreds of small and larger towns in Eastern Europe began, starting immediately after the war, to publish memorial books called Yiskerbücher. And these were collaborative projects of survivors and people from these towns living in the United States, as well as in South America, South Africa, Australia, Israel, and they put together these memorial volumes, which both told about life in the town before the Churban, and then the invocation of the names of those who had perished during it. Now, much of this memorial work, okay, and these involved texts, written texts, graphic images, pageants, programs, was done for the purpose of remembering pure and simple. They were aids to remembering. A Yisker beef book meant a memory book. So hence, it was part of a memorial project. But much of what American Jews did and said about the calamitous Hitler times went beyond memorializing pure and simple, but rather sprang from very specific political and communal concerns. So first, as shareholders, that is the Jews of the United States, as shareholders in the largest, wealthiest, most unfettered, politically robust, and institutionally elaborate Jewish community in the world, they, and they alone, had very specific tasks which they knew they had to shoulder in the face of the calamity. They had to collect the money to aid the survivors who were in the displaced persons camps well into the 1950s. Only American Jewry had the financial resources to support the remnant of European Jewry, and in the years that the survivors needed assistance, vast sums flowed from America for these projects. It is still considered to be the single largest philanthropic undertaking in human history. And we might say that never have so few, it's a small population, collected so much money in so brief a period of time. So to collect money meant that public relations material, information had to be disseminated in order to inspire people to give. So Jewish philanthropic bodies like the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and the United Jewish Appeal, which was founded in 1938 in the face of the menace from Germany, and under the umbrella of the Joint Distribution Committee, sponsored films, radio programs, pamphlets, newspaper articles, vast campaigns in all of those years spread across America to get individuals and communities and organizations to give and give and give more. The amount of material generated in this campaign was staggering, as was the size of the needs and the amount of money collected. Just as one very small example, in 1951, the New Jersey Jewish News, seeking to raise money in New Jersey, published a letter from the grave. Okay, on its front page, and it was a letter, a hypothetical, obviously, letter from a victim of the Holocaust, and he said, "In my name, give." Okay, probably the publicity event which generated the greatest and broadest audience took place, in fact, on May 1953. And those of us, I look around the audience, and some of us of a particular age will remember a television show called This Is Your Life, okay, with Ralph Edwards. And it was a show once a week, and Ralph Edwards, it was sponsored by Revlon lipstick and makeup, and every week an unsuspecting person would be dragged into the studio, and people from that person's past would come out from behind the curtains and tell about what they had done together as children, the adventures they had had, the pranks they had gotten up to as kids, and This Is Your Life. Well, in May 1953, This Is Your Life had a Holocaust survivor, Hannah Kohner, as its guest. She had been an inmate in Theresienstadt, and the show was her life with people from her childhood and her adolescence, and indeed one person who had been with her in Theresienstadt coming out from behind the curtains. The host of the show, Ralph Edwards, announced that the sponsor would not be making any ads during the program, but that all the money that they would have spent on ads would go to the United Jewish Appeal for the resettlement of displaced persons, of survivors from the displaced persons camps. This kind of fundraising went hand in hand with telling the story, and telling the story of what happened functioned as a form of memorialization. Each philanthropic enterprise for the survivors, referred to as the saving remnant, required political action and pocketbook generosity. As a second chore that the organized American Jewish community took upon itself in the post-war period was to spend its energy, not always successfully, but to spend it anyhow, on making sure that the world, that the American public, remember that it was Germany which had perpetrated crimes against the Jewish people. American Jewish communal bodies drew attention to both the evil deeds perpetrated by the Germans during the years from 1933 to 1945, and monitored and protested and informed the larger American public about such matters as the re-entry of supposedly, always in quotes, rehabilitated Nazis back into public life in West Germany. They paid close attention to and warned American public officials about the resurgence of what they saw as the resurgence of Nazism in Germany. So in 1955, Adolf Held, who was the president of the Jewish Labor Committee, sent an impassioned letter to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and it was also a press release which was sent to all the newspapers, protesting the presence of vendors who sold, quote, outspoken Nazi literature at the Frankfurt Book Fair. Held wrote to Dulles, "We are deeply shocked that our government, that is the government of the United States, does not publicly protest to the fact that there are more than 20 West German publishing firms which issue almost exclusively memoirs of former leading Nazis, literature glorifying the barbarous acts of the Nazis." Held continued his letter to Dulles by saying, quote, "The death stench of the 6 million Jews who perished in the concentration camps has not yet evaporated from the memory of those who have survived." Okay, as another example, and this was often done community by community, in the 1950s, a number of American cities entered into sister city relationships with German cities. So Cincinnati chose Munich, St. Louis chose Dusseldorf. And the local Jewish community councils, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, and other sundry bodies protested to the mayor, the city council, the larger public of Cincinnati or Milwaukee or St. Louis about forging a sister city relationship with a German city. And as the Jewish Community Council of Cincinnati said, there are many cities in the world. Why do we have to pick Munich, pick the place where Nazism was born? So the idea of informing the American public and American public officials about what American Jews saw as the fact that Nazism had not been completely defeated. It may have been defeated on the battlefield, but it's still percolated in German society, was something they took upon themselves. And like Held's letter to Dulles, it invoked the Holocaust, the death stench of the 6 million still with us. Okay, that too functioned as a form of memorialization. As American Jews experienced the post-war period, they found ample opportunity and need to refer to and analogize about the European catastrophe, creating yet another way in which the memorialization of the Holocaust by referring to it and acting upon it politically went together. They had much to say about the flowering of the American Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. And both of these also gave them opportunity to revisit the catastrophe. So the Civil Rights Movement and the way in which it invoked, in which American Jews invoked the Holocaust as a reason to justify and to defend American Jewish support for the efforts of the 1950s and then culminating in the mid-1960s, this 1964 and 1965 Civil Rights Act was legion. And so I'm going to offer probably the most broadly heard, widely disseminated example of this linkage, the memory of the Holocaust and the need for civil rights. It took place on August 28th, 1963. And I'm sure there is not a person in this room who does not know Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which was intoned from in front of the Lincoln Memorial. But 3 speakers before Martin Luther King was a speech we might call I Have a Nightmare. And this was the speech given by Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who was the president of the American Jewish Congress, a rabbi in Newark, New Jersey, and a refugee from Berlin who had come to America in the almost 1937. So when Prinz spoke, again, just 2 speakers before King, he said to the audience assembled on around the reflecting pool, and indeed to the people of the world who heard, who listened on their radios or saw on their televisions the events of Washington. He said, when I was a rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent problem, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic is silence. Okay, so this connection between the imperative for civil rights and what this one individual had learned as a rabbi in Berlin resonated widely around the world. So too, as some, not all, American Jews joined in the anti-communist crusade of the 1950s, they analogized between what they saw as the behavior of the Soviet Union and the Nazi regime. Lucy DeWittowitz, herself an outspoken anti-communist, wrote in the 1953 American Jewish Yearbook, quote, with the memory of Nazi Germany's murder of 6 million Jews fresh in their minds, American Jews were in the main convinced that only a tremendous worldwide protest could stop the further development of anti-Semitic campaigns. One Orthodox rabbi actually wrote a little booklet which took one of the common tropes of the 1950s, which was better read than dead, and he used a set of kind of, shall we say, rabbinic strategies to say, no, actually not better read than dead. We don't want to be read, but we don't want to be dead either. And he said that however horrible Stalin was, he did not compare to Hitler. So this issue of, again, linking what's going on in the Soviet Union, what should be the stance of America towards Stalinism or post-Stalinism after 1952 became a vehicle to talk about the Holocaust once again. So too some of the era's hot political issues, such as efforts to do away with America's immigration policies based on racial and national categories, and the failed effort of the United States Senate to pass the Genocide Convention, all provided moments in political time for the Jews of the United States to talk about the Holocaust. So I just want to say something briefly about the Genocide Convention, because it has a very deeply Jewish story, and it's discussion in the American political sphere was inflected with Holocaust talk, pushed by American Jewry. So the Genocide Convention was written by a man named Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin had been a Polish Jewish jurist who fled to the United States. His whole family was wiped out. And he'd been interested in genocide since he was a young lawyer and learned about the massacre of the Armenians. So it's something that had been on his mind. And when he came to the United States in 1940, he became essentially an employee or a contract for the American Jewish Committee, which encouraged him in the writing of the Genocide Convention and then in having information about it disseminated to the American public. In the aftermath of World War II, Lemkin took the Genocide Treaty to the United Nations, to the General Assembly, and it passed the General Assembly, and it then, the Genocide Treaty was to declare genocide to be a crime against humanity. So then this treaty had to go to the nations of the world one by one by one. And one of the last countries to sign it ever was the United States. Okay, so long after the Soviet Union signed it, long after every other country, the United States was recalcitrant. But every time the Genocide Convention came in front of the Senate, in 1950, 1956, then again in 1959, and then in 1961, which is where my story ends, although I will tell you the United States did pass it in 1987, quite a long time after its first appearance on the world stage. Each time it came up, American Jewish organizations went into high gear to get the Senate to pass this. And every time they worked on lobbying and testifying, it was always with the Holocaust fresh in their minds and prominent in their rhetoric. So in 1950, Jacob Blaustein, the president of the American Jewish Committee, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he said to the senators, quote, "I am appearing on behalf of the American Jewish Committee. We are concerned about genocide not only because 6 million Jews were recently murdered, but because genocide is a crime against humanity, which the civilized world must eradicate." Throughout all of those times, again, the mid-50s, late 50s, early 60s, when the Genocide Convention was debated, the American Jewish organizations all had letter writing campaigns, postcard writing campaigns, meetings with their senators when they would be back in the district. The National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, the women of the Reform movement, communicated with their chapters all over the country. Write to your senator, urge upon the U.S. Senate ratification of the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And as they said, who better than the Jew can understand the awful catastrophe which can result when any nation sets out on a path to wipe out whole communities and people? Okay, after viewing the ruins wrought by the Nazi Holocaust and witnessing the wholesale murder of 6 million Jews, we call for the passage of this bill. The Synagogue Council of America in 1952 denoted or declared that there should be once a year something called Genocide Convention Shabbat, and asking that all rabbis devote their sermon for that week to their congregants on the subject of write to your senator, tell him to pass this bill. So these were all American issues, civil rights, the Cold War, the Genocide Convention, which gave American Jews a chance to talk about the Holocaust in the name of humanity writ large. Okay, and as the Sailor of Remembrance said in English, for a future when justice and brotherhood would reign among men. But of all the issues that moved American Jewry in this period, probably none moved them more deeply to talk about the Holocaust than the issue of Israel. First, the struggle to create a sovereign state, and then to gain support for it in the United States. Now, for many whose words we have, the temporal linkage. The Holocaust ends in 1945. The State of Israel created in 1948 was more than a coincidence, but rather it was a phenomenon of biblical proportion and import, which made these two events inseparable one from the other. So here, let's listen to Professor Isaac Lewin from Yeshiva University, spokesman for American Orthodoxy, and in a book he wrote called Nochen Korban, or After the Destruction, which first appeared as a set of articles in a Yiddish newspaper and then bundled together in a book. He postulated, and the book came out in 1950, he postulated how the emergence of Israel made this Korban, the one that had just been endured, different from those other destructions of the past. This one both constituted, quote, the greatest destruction in Jewish history and created the reality of Jewish sovereignty. So here's Isaac Lewin. When the mourning for the 6 million martyrs had hardly begun, the Jewish people have taken up a task for which there is no precedent to build a home in Israel. Without help from the outside, the old wandering nation has come back to its home. Now, Lewin went on, and he noted that, quote, the wild beasts, okay, the Germans, okay, quote, did not leave behind even the smallest reminder of the victims. But he said perhaps that doesn't matter because, quote, the Jewish people can put up a memorial marker in the new home. Let the new settlements be named for the martyrs. Let the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa, and all the other cities in Israel be the memorial markers for the ripped away sons and daughters of our people. Now, little of what American Jews did and said and produced about the Holocaust, whether remembering it for its own sake or deriving a political lesson from it, civil rights, pro-war, pro-Israel, pro-Genocide Convention, little of that existed in a hermetically sealed Jewish world. And indeed, if it had, the political messages would have never gotten out. When and where they could, they shared references on efforts to memorialize the 6 million with their non-Jewish neighbors. Throughout the 1950s, in a number of cities, American Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Congress, and again other organizations met with public school officials asking for the teaching of, quote, something about the Jews who died at the hands of the Germans. Now, they were rebuffed every time, but they persisted and they kept trying. But when and where they could, they tried to get their story out to ordinary Americans who might not otherwise know about this. So I'm going to offer, again, one very obscure example, but its obscurity shows us the depth to which this went. So in 1959, a man by the name of Mr. H. Cutlass, and I don't know what the H stood for, okay, Mr. H. Cutlass, who was the principal of a workman's circle, which was a Yiddish language, mildly socialist kind of organization, which ran schools all over the United States, schools to teach Yiddish. So Mr. Cutlass, who was the principal of the Workman's Circle I.L. Parrott School in Dorchester, Massachusetts, felt obliged to speak out on the matter of the Holocaust to the local press. So in May of 1959, he wrote an enraged letter to the editor of the Boston Globe, which got published, which is how I know he wrote this. And I want to quote his words. They're very brief, but I want to quote them in full, because they indicate not only American Jewry's widespread memorialization of the Holocaust, but it's the intensity of its interest of having the story told widely and correctly. Okay. To the editor, I am writing to tell you about a drastic error which appeared in the May 4 Globe in the article covering the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. Okay, it was printed. Now this is a quote from the May 4 Globe. so upset him. Okay, it was printed, quote, "Children of the IL parrots out to the ring school, lit the candles, and later a reading in German gave a portrayal of life in the ghetto and the massacre by the Nazis," end quote. Back to Mr. Cutlass. "In the first place, your reporter should have inquired as to the language used if it were unfamiliar to him. In the second place, it should have been apparent to the reporter that whatever language would have been used, it certainly would not have been German. This was a memorial observance paying tribute to the 6 million Jews who died at the hands of the German Nazis. Therefore, it would seem incongruous to sing the praises of the martyred Jews in the German language. The children of the IL Parrots school rendered their portrayal in Yiddish, the language used by the Jews of Eastern Europe, and taught at our school. Since the appearance of your article, our school has received numerous phone calls questioning our use of German in the program. We would appreciate a retraction of your error." Now, American Jews obviously then did not shrink from letting the non-Jewish public know about the Holocaust and how they felt about it, because after all, somebody at the school had to have contacted the Globe and told them about this children's program. I mean, it was not exactly the Boston Marathon. You know, it wouldn't be kind of top on the agenda of the Boston Globe when covering local events. So the fact that the school contacted the Globe and said, "Why don't you send a reporter to cover our Warsaw Ghetto program," indicates they're inviting in the larger public. Now, the catastrophe also came in the post-war period to serve a number of decidedly inner Jewish communal projects. Mr. Cutlass made that clear also. I mean, he had a Jewish public up in arms thinking that the children under his tutelage, sent there to acquire Jewish knowledge and identity, were learning German, the language of the perpetrators. And in that vein, as post-war American Jews called variously for increased religious observance, enhanced Jewish education, greater Jewish cultural intensity and creativity, they put in the foreground the destruction of European Jewry. Those Jews, the ones who perished, communal leaders told the masses of American Jews, had been the pillars of authentic Judaism. Their communities had been the wellspring of Jewish culture, the fountains of Jewish inspiration. With the destruction of European Jewry, with the death of the 6 million, American Jews now had to pick up where the martyrs had left off. And throughout these calls for American Jews to become more Jewish in the face of the destruction, the leadership was certainly convinced that American Jews had very little communal intensity, and that they weren't up for the task, and it was now up to the leadership to help them. So again, as one example, the reform movement had been pushing for decades to create a school to train American cantors, that is Americans who would be able to sing the service. All efforts to create a cantorial school failed until 1947, when the Hebrew Union College inaugurated the School for Sacred Music. President Nelson Gluck of the Hebrew Union College, at the big ceremony held at Carnegie Hall with the New York Philharmonic playing and cantors singing, in his speech he said, with the destruction of European Jewry, the source of Jewish musical creativity has been destroyed. We American Jews now must fill their shoes and do what they cannot. One more example of this, using the Holocaust to inspire American Jews to be more Jewish, to give to Jewish causes, I will draw from Chicago. So the historian Simon Ravidovich delivered the inaugural lecture for the College of Jewish Studies in September 1948. He called upon his listeners, the students, faculty, notable guests, non-Jews among them, including the presidents of the University of Chicago, Northwestern, DePaul, Loyola, all sitting in the audience. He called upon them, and the school's financial backers, who are probably the most important group, since without financial backing there is no school. He called upon them to remember, quote, that our brethren in the Polish ghettos under Hitler kept up the traditional ideal of Jewish learning. The way they learned, youth and aged, up to the last moments of their lives, until they were thrown into the gas chambers, will stand forever as one of the most glorious pages in our history. Okay, not the ghetto fighting, but the learning that went on within the ghettos and the camps. Okay, then back to Rabbi Davidge. This should be our unforgettable lesson everywhere at all times. The implication could not be clearer. If Jews could keep on studying Jewish texts in the death camps, then surely they could, and they should do so in the beneficent environment of America and in Chicago specifically. So the catastrophe provided the leadership of American Jewry with a powerful tool as it went about constructing a new kind of American Jewish culture in the post-war period. Now, before I close, I do want to note that as American Jews in the post-war period did this, scattered, amorphous, every place, everybody doing it their own way, and arguing among themselves as to which was a fitting memorial, which was the best, they had to do so from scratch. They had no obvious precedent to guide them as they took their first steps towards creating new ceremonies, writing new liturgies, orchestrating pageants, which took as their theme the horrendous stories of death and destruction, mass murders, gassings, and cremations. Nearly nothing of this, in fact we might even say nothing of this sort existed in the general American culture, which Jews could adapt for their own use to mark their catastrophe. They couldn't look around and see other ethnic communities which had, which presented itself to the larger society through a devastating tragedy, particularly one perpetrated on foreign soil. No minority group in America had created a museum, erected a monument on public space, organized university courses, or held annual and visibly lachrymose commemorations open to all, which focused on the painful events of their pasts. American Jews had to embark upon this on their own. They had no domestic partners in doing this, nor did they have any foreign ones. And indeed, Jews in other countries looked to American Jewry to create because they were the largest, they were the most endowed. So heated discussions about how to memorialize the Holocaust reflected the inner cleavages of, and the pluralistic nature of American Jewry. Jewish life got lived out in thousands of institutions and local communities, divided by ideology, function, class, length of time in the United States. No national body told them what to do, and indeed, the utter disorganization of American Jewish life was one of the main themes of American Jewish history. So to bring this to a close, in that anarchic environment, no one opposed recalling the victims of the Holocaust, aiding the survivors, pointing out the evils of the perpetrators, or using the events of the Holocaust to pursue a political agenda. They may have differed as to what that political agenda should be, but they didn't argue that it provided the most potent weapon to pursue it. No one disagreed with the premise that Jewish communal institutions, schools for the young, through seminaries which trained rabbis, the Jewish press, the multiplicity of organizations, philanthropic, cultural, political, and religious, all had a share in remembering the 6 million and using that memory to shape the post-war world. But since they had no guide as to how to do it, no central authority which told them what to do, each did it as they saw fit. They could essentially do no more, but they also believed that they could do no less. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasia. So let's have the student
because students are always hesitant, but it's best for students to speak first. Yes.
Okay, so to what extent do you think that the effects of the Holocaust immediately after it was over were like sterilized or like I would use the term like whitewashed to mean like made like easier for like the masses to like understand?
Okay, did everyone hear the question?
Does it make sense?
It does make sense, and the question was, in these early, in these early years, to what extent was the, were discussions about the Holocaust sterilized or whitewashed to be more palatable? Well, I think that, you know, if we think about the Sailor of Remembrance, part of the part I didn't read, where it said, "Come see us Christians that they remember anymore." They slew the blameless and the pure, men, women, and children with vapors of poison and ovens of gas. Now, is that whitewashed or sterilized? I mean, it's kind of lyrical. It's sort of lofty, but no, I think that there was a kind of bluntness about it. There was a lot of discussion about at what age children should get the sort of full range of detail. And so when I mentioned that there were efforts to have the public schools and a number of cities teach this, one of the other things the Jewish communal organizations, and again, all on their own, this place, that place, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Washington, Boston, did was when books about the Holocaust came out, they would buy up dozens of copies and they placed them in the libraries, in the public school, in the public libraries, as well as in school libraries. And so they would discuss, you know, at the committee meeting, should this book go in elementary school library or middle school or high school? Which is the appropriate level? Okay, there was a book called by Gerda Weissman-Klein called All But My Life. She was a she'd been in Auschwitz, and then marries an American soldier, and so so could a middle school student read that, or should we say that put it in the high school? So it's not whitewashing, it's kind of trying to figure out what's the most fitting way to do this. We should remember that knowledge, the degree of knowledge we have now, didn't exist at the time. I mean, their first piecing together, I mean, they have a big story of what happened, but they're first piecing together, you know, the actual building block, empirical data of what happened and how, and they're first creating they're creating the first archives. Okay, they are involved with gathering material. So I think that it may be that in our times, okay, the times we're in now, there may be greater tolerance for very graphic images, but I think there wasn't a lot of tolerance for very graphic images about anything at the time. So it was at the same level that if there was a war movie, for example, a World War II movie, or a movie about World War I, or the Korean War, somebody would get shot, you wouldn't see innards trailing, coming out. I think a war movie now is truly blood and guts, and so we have a much higher, for whatever reason, I think we have much higher tolerance for that than they did then. And so the kind of Holocaust, the degree of graphicness was appropriate for the time.
All right, before the next question, could you please do me a favor and fill out these evaluations or on your share? I really appreciate that, all of you. It helps us program better for you to do a better job.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Hasia. I know you from conferences. I'm sure you don't remember me. In your remarks, you mentioned all kinds of people, poets, rabbis, and so on. No historians, no political scientists.
Right.
And I know that there was some difficulty, resistance. Raoul Hilberg, the definitive book on the Holocaust, on the perpetrators, couldn't persuade his thesis director to accept his subject, and then when he finally defied him and did it anyway, had tremendous trouble getting it published. it was dismissed as inconsequential, unnecessary, and so on and so forth. Could you comment on that?
Sure.
Aspect?
Okay, absolutely.
He was one of your predecessors as a speaker.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, I'm kind of odd. So the question is about scholarship. So remember, there's no scholarship till there are archives. There are no archives till documents are assembled, cataloged, indexed, and so on. And so a number of American Jewish institutions are involved from the immediate end of the war to create these archives and to get them usable by scholars. So, and the fact that Hilbert worked in German archives, writing about perpetrators is very different than a history of the victims. But there is an already a kind of early history, historiography of this. So the journals, Jewish Social Studies, which had been founded by Morris Raphael Cohn, Louis Wirth, and so on in the 30s, is one of the first venues to publish articles, small articles about what happened in very specific ways. In 1950, a Polish Jewish historian by the name of Philip Friedman, he was a survivor himself, came to the United States, and he had an adjunct position at Columbia, and he taught European Jewry 1914 to 1945. Okay, so in his papers, you even see the exams he gave for the class and correspondence between Friedman and other historians who are eager to know more. Where does he get his material and the like? There was a historian of Germany named Kopel Pinson who taught at Queens College, and he was primarily a scholar of German nationalism. But he too is all over giving lectures to quasi-scholarly bodies, writing articles. So when Hilberg, there is a tendency, and I'm going to put Hilberg in this category, and I'm going to put another kind of icon of Holocaust culture, Elie Wiesel, in this category, of essentially saying I was the first one, and nobody wanted to hear it. And the fact is, that just there was material out there, pales by comparison to what starts getting published in the post-Hilberg era, but he didn't come to this with no peers doing this work. And so I'm kind of more interested, not more interested, I am interested in the way in which individuals become so associated with a particular kind of new direction need to claim they were the first and it was truly new, when you could piecemeal go through and see it wasn't. Oh, okay, I don't want to, should I be that? Okay, yes.
I have two questions. You kind of implied that the Jews were against all the communists, but
yeah.
I was wondering with the effect of McCarthyism in the early 50s, which seemed to make, I mean, I was very little, but to make people afraid to talk out, and certainly were people who were against McCarthyism, and also the effect of capturing Eichmann, where all of a sudden the images were much more available suddenly.
Okay, great. So two important questions. So for those Jews who were on the left, I mean, so I quoted Lucy DeWitowitz, who was, you know, unabashed anti-communist, okay, and cheered, by the way, the execution of the Rosenbergs, okay. But Jews on the left also invoked the Holocaust as they said, what's going on in America with the witch hunts and the suppression of free speech and the kind of dissolution of civil liberties is the first step towards Nazism. And so Mars Shappies, who edits Jewish Currents, which was a left publication, and he must have, the Holocaust must show up in every issue of Jewish Currents in this period. So I think people were afraid necessarily to speak out about, some people were afraid to speak out. Mars Shappies wasn't afraid. He went to jail for part of the time. But they weren't afraid to talk out about the Holocaust. Now, I end with the Eichmann in 62, 63, because in fact that's an important turning point in terms of a public discussion. Okay, and that therefore it seems to be another era. And so I'm interested in, I was interested, or am interested in essentially what preceded that, which laid the groundwork for the kind of Eichmann era explosion of Holocaust material. But that wasn't a very important turning point. But again, it didn't create it, it just built on what had been there before.
Okay, 2 more questions. Yes.
I'm just going to speak about my parents who were Holocaust survivors, and I'm going into totally the private realm. But I think it's important, and some background. At that point, American Jews were actually just getting on their own feet, dealing with anti-Semitism, getting to feel more secure. And then you had no real contact on a private level between the survivors and American Jews, who kept to their own circle. Survivors didn't even join synagogues because they were all American Jews. The survivors referred to them as the natives, and they survived, called themselves greenhorns, and they came not speaking English and being impoverished. So when the contacts came, the philanthropist and dentist decided to help my father, free service to his teeth. When my father opened his mouth, he screamed at him, "How could you neglect your teeth?" That's horrible. My father said, "Well, you're giving me free services, because don't you know starvation?" No, there's no excuse for this. And that was the kind of stuff we're dwelling on this. We had sugar rationing, and we couldn't get stockings, so we know how it was. So there was this withdrawal after this. And, in a certain way, it's understandable. But I just wanted to say that amongst Jews, the survivors, the Americans, every child of a survivor will say the parents were friends with all these people like them. When it came to being with Americans, it was like, we're self-conscious, and so on. Anyway, said enough.
Okay, I think the history of the entry of survivors into America and the kinds of institutions they built for themselves and the ways in which they did or did not participate in communal institutions. We have lots of personal memories. Nobody has written that history yet, and it's a project that really needs to be.
Elie wrote a chapter, I just have to say, in the book. It's called "A Jew Today," and the end of it is called, his essay is called "The Plea for the Survivors."
Yeah, so Elie Wiesel was not a historian. He didn't spend years in archives going through the papers of this organization and that organization and piecing together a story. Now, it's not a criticism of Wiesel. He was not a historian, and no historian has yet tackled that subject. And it would be, I would love for one of my PhD students to be willing to do it, but it's enormous, but it would be terribly important.
One last question to that.
Okay.
Jim?
Yeah, survivor's guilt, I think, is a piggyback on that one. In the background, I hear American Jews have relatives over there who did not come. They did not get out of the show. How did that affect this whole thing? So the liturgy, was it memories of grandma? Was it leading to the larger questions?
Right, it took multiple forms. You can't say it took any one form. And again, how American Jews and survivors interacted with each other is one story. What kinds of institutional assistance was made and how survivors were talked about in these public gatherings was something else. And so, for example, as I began, or as I said, every community in the United States, or every reasonably sized community, had a Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Program. Again, I can tell you, Akron, Ohio, Kansas City, Missouri, New York had 4, Washington, D.C. 2, and so on. And every one of them had a survivor who spoke and told of their experiences. And they would have the lighting of six symbolic candles, and the candles were always lit by survivors. Often they would be referred to as New Americans. Now, after the program, did they talk to each other? That I can't know, but I can tell you what was on the printed programs. And the organizers of these events would, you can see in the minutes of the committees, again, that's what the historian does. You sit there and look at really boring committee meeting, mini notes, and you see that, in fact, there's this rich material of how people are thinking. I say we have to contact the New Americans Club, okay, with the survivor organizations, to get, often they would get 6 women to come in, 6 survivor women to light the candles. Okay, so they're not invisible, and their presence is, however, maybe certain guilt, maybe on the part of the American Jews who could, many of them say, but for an accident of history, my parents or my grandparents got on that boat and left. Purely accidental. The ones who came to America were not smarter, they weren't more insight. Circumstantial that, my parents got on the boat, and these those who didn't face this onslaught. So was that guilt? Maybe. I'm not sure this is, I think, a psychiatric or a psychological term that I'm not, I just don't know how to engage it. But it's a great question.
All right, let's give
So I guess you're go on there. All right, take your favorite number.